Hello, my name is Tom Hydeen. I'm a ministry assistant here at First Reformed Church, and we are going to be sharing from our series that the pastors are preaching on called Unchained, a focus on the Ten Commandments. And what we will be presenting today is what we call page 7, bonus sermon content. And I have a friend here.
Well, thanks for calling me your friend, Tom. I appreciate that. My name is Lyle Lundgren. I serve as Connections Coordinator at church. And Tom and I get to share a little bit deeper about, like Tom said, the Unchained series and where it's taken us. And at this time, I would like to read a passage from Matthew. It comes from Matthew 22, verse 36 through 40. It says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments."
You know, Lyle, you did some study with and bringing many of these passages together, and I was surprised that there were so many passages in the Old and New Testament about loving your neighbor. I didn't know that there were so many, and God certainly put a high regard on this. I find it interesting in what Jesus answered is they asked him what was the greatest commandment, and then he gave us two. So are they both the same, or are they equal in importance? I think so. There's another passage that you came up with, and it's from Leviticus, and it says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." I found it curious that he sort of put his stamp of authority on that command. He doesn't do that on every command, but again, I think he just shows that he holds that very, very important.
And to me, just the fact that God connects his own person in the same breath of what we have to do and he calls us to do, and that's to love our neighbor.
Good point.
Galatians 5, verse 14 says, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself." So, I ask myself a little bit, what does it mean to love my neighbor as myself? Aren't we in humility to put others before ourselves instead of always loving myself? But, that kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit.
Yeah.
And what it looks like in today's society to love our neighbor as ourselves. You got any thoughts on that?
Well, I know I don't have any trouble loving myself.
Sure.
I have trouble loving other people. So it seems to me when Jesus or God puts this together that the expectation is really high, but also very difficult.
Sure.
Because there are situations we find ourselves in that make it hard to know how to show love to not just the guy next door, but beyond that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
There's another passage that I think really ties the commandments and the Unchained series together, and it's from Romans 13, verse 9. It says this, "The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself." And these are pretty serious words that are brought to us from the Romans text. And I find it easy to be neighborly with those people that I have something in common with, who like to fish, who like the outdoors, who like to mow their yard. But, what do I do when I have that neighbor that just doesn't fit into my mold of what a neighbor should be? I think of, I pick up some trash that came over from my neighbor's yard, and I pick it up, and then I try to take care of things, but the same habits continue to go on and on and on. I find it hard to love my neighbor in those situations. So what can I do when I don't see eye to eye with somebody? Is everybody considered my neighbor? I live in a neighborhood where Mary and I are some of the last of couples that are the last original ones since we've lived there for 32 years. So everybody else is new.
New people have moved in,
Yeah.
and other ones have moved out.
Yeah, and from different places, not just in the state of Iowa, but from different places all over. So that command to love my neighbor as myself is getting harder and harder to do.
I guess we can't assume that we're all the same, and so then that commonality is taken away. Maybe just something as simple as, greet them when you can, and not be overt about that, but wave to them. It's even trickier when they don't wave back, or when they go right into their garage. And I heard someone say that the garage door opener has worked against neighborliness, because you don't have to look at each other. You can escape right in, and so we don't have one. We don't.
You have to do it manually.
Right. So that is harder, especially if I've heard folks tell of neighbors who don't cut their grass, or they have just a bunch of stuff hanging around, and they don't clean up, and they don't care. That probably speaks to some of my bias and my prejudice, but I need to get over that, because I'm sure that there's people who are loving me that look past my biases and prejudices as well.
Tom, if you lived next door to me, I would have no problem loving you. That's a good thing, right?
I hope so.
That's a good thing.
The rub is, Jesus talks about loving a neighbor. We think of the person next door, but how does that expand to many more people, and how to show that? And how do we give money to the man standing at the intersection in Sioux City who says he doesn't have a job? And I always think about that Good Samaritan story, and other people drove by and walked by and didn't do anything. And should we stop? I don't know. And that's not easy.
No.
Not easy to know.
No. There's a couple passages that probably touch on that. Romans 15 verse 2 talks about each of us should please our neighbors for their good, to build them up, not to tear them down. And we've been privy to welcoming some new families, not only into our church but also into Orange City. I think of families that come to us from the Ukraine and from Colombia and new people. I reference a lot of times when I would teach at school, and we'd go home on Friday, and on Monday there's 3 or 4 new students that may be transferred into our school district, not just from other towns, but from other countries.
So much at our doorstep, these things of loving other people.
Yeah.
There's a document. It's called the Heidelberg Catechism, and it was written in the 1500s during the Reformation era as a way to guide people into knowing the truths of God's Word. And these gentlemen, they were young guys that wrote this, a 22-year-old and a 24-year-old, but they had some really insights that are very amazing. And this is what they wrote about the commandment, thou shalt not kill.
Sure.
And that deals with neighbor. And it says about this commandment, I am not to belittle, insult, hate, or kill my neighbor, not by my thoughts, my words, my look, or gesture, and certainly not by actual deeds. I am not to be party to these in others. Rather, I am to put away all desire for revenge. I am not to harm or recklessly endanger myself either. So all those words of belittling, insult, by thoughts, words, gestures, that gets pretty close to home, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And I can say I haven't killed anyone, but Jesus too said if you're angry with someone, he gets farther down into my heart than I like to get.
Yeah.
So it's much broader than that.
A couple of thoughts that come to my mind, especially in my role here at church as connections coordinator, we talk about the body of Christ, the body of believers. In Ephesians 4, verse 25, it says, therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. And so if I don't greet my neighbor in God's love, and I don't greet my neighbor and treat my neighbor with truth, I'm really going away from. I remember in high school there was a bracelet that had WWJD on it. What would Jesus do? And so I think of, how am I going to treat my neighbor? And it's very easy to look inward and say, well, I want people to treat me like Jesus would treat me.
Right.
But more importantly, we're called to treat others, whether they're our immediate neighbor or whether there's somebody we meet. I'm going to the state wrestling tournament this weekend. Somebody I meet in Des Moines. They really are our neighbors. And how I treat them is really a reflection of who Jesus is.
That passage you read, for we are all members of one body. I found that curious, that my response to other people in the body, or broader than that, ends up affecting me as well. I don't want it to be a selfish thing that I better treat someone nicely so that they treat me nicely, but we're all connected in one body, and what happens on one part of the body affects the other. If we have a cold, our whole body feels miserable. If I have a toothache, everything hurts. If I have to go in for surgery, the whole body is nervous about it, and we're all connected. So again, God puts a high value on loving your neighbor as yourself.
Yes, he does. Earlier, and kind of in closing, you mentioned the story of the Good Samaritan. And it says, the young ruler that Jesus was instructing during this time, Jesus asked, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. And so I want to make sure that, if I want to live I don't want to just live in a neighborhood that I don't know people. I want to live in a neighborhood that is vibrant, and I want to live in a body that is serving each other, and then have maybe a block party, or maybe have something that is really pouring into other people like Jesus has given to us through his grace and mercy and has really poured into us.
Now, Lyle, earlier you said you'd love me if I moved next door to you. So should Carl and myself think about moving to the other side of town, other side of the tracks?
The bottom of my house is empty. My sons are all moved out. So if you want to live in the basement and come up every once in a while, you'd have to put up with Lucy, my dog, though.
Okay, we could do that.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate your words.
Well, a challenge for all of us.
Yep. Thank you.